which is part 3 of the prophetic books. So we're going to carry on with the prophetic book. I'm sure you're tired of the prophets by now, but this is not going to be a long lecture. Right, so we're going to start with Jonah. And brief summary of Jonah is when a prophet refuses to go to an enemy city, it has a disastrous result. When he does go, the results are very challenging to him. And the time of when it was written was about 760 BC. The name Jonah is for the most part associated with children's Bibles and Sunday school stories, and in particular the image of Jonah in the belly of a big fish. However, the book contains much more than the simple childhood image. We will do well to study the book in its context. The book is unique in the Old Testament prophetic literature. It does not contain oracles or message of a prophet, but rather tells a story of an incident in the life of one of the prophets. Jonah the prophet is mentioned outside the book of Jonah only in 2 Kings 14:25 during the reign of Jeroboam II, which places the prophet towards the middle of the 8th century, plus minus 760 BC. He must therefore have been a contemporary of both Amos and Hosea, and you can look at your table for reference for that. And also, we don't know anything more about him as a person, his calling or his ministry in Israel. Background of Jonah: during the time before Jeroboam II in the 9th century BC, the Assyrians had expanded their territory into the kingdom of Israel. By the time Jeroboam came to the throne, the Assyrians had experienced something of a setback, allowing Jeroboam to reign much of the land he had previously lost. Since the Assyrians possessed less of a threat, there seems to have been no immediate need to condemn the Assyrians as the major enemies, which they later did become when they destroyed the northern kingdom in Samaria in 722 BC. Understanding the book of Jonah, many interpreters have seen Jonah as a message to the people of Israel, with a missiological, in other words, to do with mission theme. Namely, Israel and Christians should reach out to all the nations. Although a valid biblical theme, it is unlikely that the mission as such is a major focus of Jonah. It is more likely the relationship between God and Jonah, representing the nation of Israel, that comes to the fore in the book. In other words, that most likely Jonah was written almost like a parable that God was pursuing and ordering Jonah to do something. Jonah didn't do it, and eventually Jonah did end up doing it. So basically Jonah represents Israel and what God has to do to Israel. Both Jonah, Israel, and Nineveh, the Gentiles, are in need of God's undeserved grace. The biggest lesson in Jonah is that God is merciful and can, in fact, He will bestow grace on anyone of His choosing in His own sovereign way. God shows His grace to a disobedient prophet and shows the same grace to an unbelieving sailors by saving them after they had thrown Jonah overboard. The Ninevites, Assyrians, were known for their disregard of human life and dignity, yet at the smallest indication of repentance, God is willing to postpone the inevitable judgment pronounced by Jonah. Some themes that are found in the book of Jonah: God's grace is overflowing. God does not destroy Jonah when he flees. He spares Jonah in the storm. He saves Jonah by sending a fish. He's willing to use a disobedient prophet again. He gives Jonah shade. He allows Jonah to query him in his decisions. God's grace is undeserved, as experienced by both Jonah, which is Israel, and Nineveh, the nations. It reminds us of God's grace in the New Testament through Jesus Christ. The Lord seeks repentance in order to show His mercy, a message found many times in both the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament. Serving God is a matter of the heart and not of ritual, when God allows interaction with Himself. So that was Jonah. We move to Micah. Micah guides the Judean king through the Assyrian threat. Micah, whose name can be translated as "who is like Yahweh," was a contemporary of Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos. Once again, you can look at your table to see the times which they were ministering. He came from a small town, Moreshet, west of Jerusalem in the hills of Judea. Although his ministry focus was primarily the southern kingdom during the reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, he also included Samaria in his oracles. Micah is referred to in the book of Jeremiah about 100 years later, when he is quoted as saying the same thing as Jeremiah. Some things about the writing of Micah. It is highly likely that Micah's prophecies were written down during the time of his ministry or shortly thereafter. He certainly made an impact in his day, causing his message to be remembered even 100 years later during the time of Jeremiah. Some more critical scholars question the early dates of the oracles of hope that are found in chapter 2, 4, and 7. But there is no compelling reasons why these could not have been written or uttered during Micah's lifetime. A little bit of a background on him. The political economic success of Hosea in the early part of the 8th century, just before Micah, brought luxury to some but poverty and oppression to others. Micah addresses these conditions in some of his oracles, interpreting the Assyrians' assault as God's judgment of the nation. During his time, the Assyrians not only overthrew Samaria, but also became a major threat to Judea by taking the Judean city of Lachish during the reign of Hezekiah in 701. And you can see that in Micah chapter 1, verse 13. The theme in Micah, well, one of them is that God is deliverer. God promises deliverance to his people. He uses human beings, kings, Messiah, and sometimes even the enemy to bring about his salvation. In chapter 5, 2-9, there seems to be a definite reference to a future leader king who would rise and bring deliverance to the people, the new David. This reference is quoted in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, in reference to the birth of Jesus. And also, God requires a heart that is in the right place. God is more pleased by the attitude and lifestyle of his people than he is interested in the practice of certain rituals. Right, so we're going to be looking at Nahum, or the way you say it is Nahum, a message of judgment against the Nineveh, capital of the Assyria. The prophet of Nahum, the word Nahum means comfort or consolation. His book is a message of destruction for Nineveh, and that would have been a message of consolation for the nation she had oppressed. The only thing we know about Nahum is found in chapter 1, verse 1, which says he was from Al-Kosh. But we don't know where that was because it is not mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. Some think it is the town of Capernaum near Galilee, because Capernaum in Hebrew means the village of Nahum. Kfar Nahum, the village of Nahum. The book opens with the words, an oracle concerning Nineveh. Nineveh, the capital city of Assyrians, was the same city that the prophet Jonah visited sometimes before. The prophet Nahum only had judgment to proclaim upon the city, unlike his friend Jonah. Some writings of the book of Nahum. The unusual opening of Nahum was a psalm has led some scholars to question this section as coming from a prophet. Some similarities between Isaiah and Nahum point to the fact that the prophet either knew of each other or shared a similar prophetic tradition. In other words, maybe they were even in that school of prophets, the same school of prophets, with Isaiah being the leader and Nahum being a disciple, a student. The date of the book depends on the existence and the fall of Nineveh. In chapter 3, verse 8, there is reference to the fall of the city of Thebes, in Hebrew No Ammon, which happens in 663 BC, indicating that the book was written after this time. The date of the prophet should therefore be between 663 and 612 during the reign of Josiah. A bit of background. At three different times in ancient history, the Assyrians dominated upper part of the Mesopotamia and rose to power. The Second Assyrian Empire under Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V and Sargon probably reached its pinnacle during the latter part of the 8th century and first half of the 7th century. They were responsible for the fall of Samaria in 722 BC, a very important date. This wickedness and cruelty are well attested in literature, something that led to their destruction and condemnation is seen also in Isaiah 14:24 and Zephaniah 2:13 to 15. What was the purpose and the message of Nahum? The purpose of the prophecy is to announce the damnation and destruction of the Assyrians, represented by the capital city. The oracles were probably intended as an encouragement to Judah, who must have felt very vulnerable at that time. It is unlikely that this book and its message were intended for or ever reached the Ninevites themselves. Behind the foretelling of the destruction of Nineveh was the message that God is still in control, also of the surrounding nations and empires. It was a message to Israel to see that God is the God of all the nations, not just Israel, and if He wills it, it will be. Some themes: God is in control of all the nations, as I said. God is just and will punish evil. In much of the Old Testament, the Assyrian nation stands for evil, just as Babylon represented evil in the book of Revelation, an opponent of God's people. Nahum announced the destruction, and by implication, the fact that God judges the nation's enemies and brings justice and salvation to His people. And so we move to the book of Habakkuk, a very nice book, short book, but a really powerful book. A prophet's struggle to come to grips with God's lack of judgment on Judah, and then questions the way He does decide to do it. The book provides no detail about the prophet or his time, causing us to rely on eternal evidence to date him as describe something of his background. The prophet is best dated before any of the hostile contact between Judah and Babylon. The Lord was still raising up, in chapter 1 verse 6, the Chaldeans, namely the Babylonians. Our closest guess for the ministry of Habakkuk is between 630 and 605 BC, with the writing of the book not longer after this date. Bit of background: the Assyrian Empire was on its last legs and probably too weak to have much of an effect of the kingdom of Judah. This may have led to widespread injustice, violence, and wickedness among the people, a leftover of the reign of the evil Manasseh, grandfather of Josiah. By 627, the city of Babylon was seized by the Assyrian rebels, only to be taken over by the Chaldeans in 626, which was the start of the establishment of the Babylonian Empire. Message of Habakkuk: against the background of evil in the land, Habakkuk wonders about the justice of God when there was so much evil in Judah. The Assyrian God instrument seems to have weakened, and the Assyrians, which God's instrument, seems to have weakened, and Habakkuk got the impression that Judah was getting away with it. God's response was that He was raising up another instrument, namely the Babylonians. So in other words, that God could rise another army because of the disobedience of Israel, and that was, in a way, Habakkuk was not happy about it, because how can a just God use a wicked nation such as the Babylonians to punish His people? God's response by assuring the prophet that the Babylonians will also be punished in His own time. In order for us to understand Habakkuk, apart from the little bits we find in Jonah, Habakkuk is the only prophet that includes a full-blown conversation between God and a prophet. The uniqueness of the book lies in the fact that the prophet questions God's action. The key to understanding Habakkuk lies in the response of God, similar to the book of Job. However, unlike the book of Job, God did provide his prophet with some answers. People will be held responsible for the wickedness or for the actions, and God will punish wickedness in his own time. Some themes: God is aware of the evil done by the nations around the world. He is the final judge and will punish evil whenever it has run its full course, or when God's patience has been tested to the full. Although we, like Habakkuk, Judah and Job, may think that God does not see evil and will not treat it with justice, the message of Habakkuk assures us that God is sovereign and reigns over all the nations with justice. God is in control. And so we move to the book of Zephaniah. The prophet announced judgment on Judah and the nations. So you can see judgment, one after another, one prophet after another, just constant judgment on Judah, on Israel, on the nations, or God uses the nations. It's just constant judgment on them, and eventually we get to the end where God has just had enough. The prophet Zephaniah. Zephaniah means Yahweh has hidden, perhaps a reference to the conditions when he was born. He's the only prophet who traces his own genealogy, mentions the name Hezekiah, likely to have been the former king of Judah. Zephaniah therefore could have been part of the royal family and living in Jerusalem. He was an early contemporary of the prophet Jeremiah, placing him in the late days of Judah and the time of Josiah, 640 to 609. His ministry coincides with the fall of Nineveh, 612, and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. Some things about his writing and dates. Josiah was responsible for some of major reforms. You can see that in 2 Chronicles 34, which took place around 622 BC. Since Zephaniah was very critical of the Baal worship of his day, the logic is that his ministry predated the reforms brought about by Josiah. A date around 627 for the prophet's ministry and writing would fit the religious problems he addresses, as well as the political rambling of the weakening Assyria and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. Bit of background: Manasseh introduces major evil and adultery into the kingdom of Judah. His evil son Ammon reigns for only a short while before Josiah becomes king, when he was only a child of 7 or 8 years old. Zephaniah preaches a message of judgment against Judah and the neighboring nations. It may even be that his ministry inspired the young king Josiah to start his reform, thus postponing the fulfillment of God's judgment. Purpose and the message of Zephaniah. Zephaniah's prophecies were directed at Judah in a hope that the pronouncement of God's judgment would bring about the necessary reforms. And to some extent it did for a little while. The prophet believed that the day of the Lord, a day of judgment, was fast approaching. The only way out was humble repentance. He includes prophecies against other nations as well: Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Cush, and Assyria. The book concludes with a promise of restoration. And that brings us to the end of lecture 7. Hope you enjoy it, and I will send you all the emails shortly. God bless.